2021 report from the Climate Bonds Initiative. I'll introduce our speakers in a minute as we get going, but usually it takes about another minute before all the dial-ins come through. Okay. I'm going to get going. We are now live on YouTube as well as in Zoom. For those of you that would like to see a recording of this because you are so excited by the comments Jessica's going to make in a minute, you'll be able to see the recording of this immediately afterwards on YouTube, and it will stay there forever. Just search for Climate Bonds Initiative on YouTube and you'll find a whole channel, a cornucopia of useful stuff. But this particular webinar, most importantly of all, will be available soon. This webinar is about sustainable debt, the Global State of the Market Report for 2021. We are thrilled to have a few important speakers with us today. We have Berit Lindholt-Lorentzen from the International Finance Corporation, a part of the World Bank Group. We have Paul O'Connor, who's the head of ESG EMEA Debt Capital Markets for JP Morgan. We have Jessica Pillay, who's the co-head of policy and markets at the UK Debt Management Office. And of course, the huge issue of green bonds just in the past year, a story to be told there. And then finally, we have Jesus Martinez, who's the head of financing and treasury at Iberdrola. Iberdrola, you may not know, has now issued some $18 billion worth of green bonds over the years, starting a long time ago in April 2014. We'll hear that story in a minute. But before we get going, we're going to listen to Krista Tukainen, who's our head of market intelligence at Climate Bonds, talk about the report that we are launching, or rather we have launched this week. We are explaining to you today. A couple of words of background. You know what the challenge is. We have an extraordinary challenge to address climate change, to address our sustainability issues, to address how we run the planet. And that includes what we've laid out in the Sustainable Development Goals for the United Nations, about things we have to do to bring the bottom billion up to a reasonable, even a passable standard of living, to address peace, to address the horrors that we continue to experience in different corners of the world through fair and equitable development. There's lots and lots of issues involved here. In the climate area, just a few weeks ago, we saw the launch of the Intergovernmental Panel of Climate Change report, which is frankly terrifying. It's basically saying that unless we get our emissions down 50% by 2030, we are looking at utterly catastrophic levels of climate change. And that's not gently rising sea levels. That is a jagged, volatile century of very severe disruptions and massive, realistically massive loss of life. Even if we meet that amazing target, and it's such an amazing target because we have failed so miserably over the last 30 years to get emissions down, by the way, it's our fault. If we meet that target, and I continue to be optimistic that we will find a way to do it, we still have to deal with the fact that we've lost the first fight of climate change, and we have to deal with resilience. We have to prepare our societies for the volatility that is already baked in for the 21st century. And that will mean increased investments in social activities to ensure that we can better bounce back from a crisis. We learned a lot during the pandemic about what it takes to bounce back from a crisis. Everything from free healthcare for all to the ability to be able to deploy funds quickly to keep people with money to be able to buy food while they can't work. These are examples of social investments. Note that the European social bond program, immensely successful, is to finance unemployment relief in the context of the pandemic. An absolutely brilliant investment, which is also a climate resilience investment because the pandemics are a feature of climate change, at least according to the IPCC. All of these things come together in a huge task we have in front of us to rethink, recalibrate, reimagine the way we organize, plan, build, and run our societies. That's everything from clean energy. And I'm going to tell you, in Europe at the moment, the edge around clean energy is very much being felt in terms of the response to the war in Ukraine that's raging now. So there are geopolitical reasons which are part of this. Of course, that war is a war being perpetrated by a petrostate dictator using funds from fossil fuel activity. So it's not exactly removed from the addressing climate change. Bear that in mind. But it's driving home the need to do something about it. But there's so much more to be done too, because we are dealing with the problems of lack of food arising from the war, food scarcity across MENA and Africa at the moment, which is going to lead to major social problems that we need to address as a planet this year, and so on and so on and so on. The capital required to address the challenges that we currently face is estimated to be somewhere between 90 and $100 trillion US by 2050. That is a huge capital pile. Luckily, a reasonable chunk of that is a reorienting of existing capital flows. Think more railways, fewer freeways, if you like. There is a capex pile, higher capital cost. If you build a solar plant, there's a higher capex than if you build a gas plant, for example, that is going to be there, which is probably about 10%. But we have savings pools that we have never had on this planet before. We are rolling in capital. We have never seen as much. We need to find places to put it, in fact. That's what's been driving down bond yields the last few years. There's surplus of capital, there's excess liquidity, if you like. We know that if we can create green and social and sustainable investments, investors will flock to them. That's the story of this report. An astounding story of achievement of coming up with a product, an instrument of finance which matches the anxieties and long-term concerns of investors with the activities of corporates and governments to try and address those concerns. That's what this is. We have proof of concept. The money will flow. We just need to package the deal. So today, we're going to hear about what has happened in the past year and what the experience of our panelists are in getting these deals going. On that note, I'd like to turn it over to Krista with just one note. There's a Q&A bottom at the bottom of the screen. If you want to ask questions, ask a question in the Q&A, and I will attempt to pick up the ones that are most pertinent to our panelists. Please, Krista, over to you to present to us what's in this report and what are the key features.
Thank you very much, Sean, for that introduction. I'm just bringing up this slideshow that you can see a little bit of the key findings of this report. Hopefully you can see this up on your screen right now. So thank you to everybody on my behalf as well for joining us for this webinar. My name is Krista Tokian and I'm the Head of Market Intelligence for Climate Bonds Initiative. Before we start, I'd like to say another thank you to our sponsors, IFC, JP Morgan, and the Luxembourg Green Exchange for supporting this paper, and obviously also our lovely additional speakers, Jessica Poulet from the UK DMO and Jesus Martinez from Iberdrola for coming to share some additional issuer perspectives on this important topic today. So you've already had the introductions as to who we are, so we can dive straight into the report findings themselves. I will talk a little bit about
Krista, can you just change the format to get rid of the next slide so we can see the slide in a little bit bigger format?
Yes, I can.
Thank you.
Hang on one moment. Bear with us on the technical difficulties here. I will reshare the screen and see if we can actually get it to be a little bit more user-friendly. Absolutely. One moment. Sean, if you want to make any other introductory remarks on the panel in the meantime, I'll troubleshoot and then we can come back to the actual presentation.
Yeah, I'm just going to leave our audience with this comment, which is our goal today is to excite you about this incredible opportunity to do more in this sector, but also the urgency of doing more. We are only something like 1/10 of the way to the kind of market that we need, which would be representative of the capital flows we actually need here. We've had an incredible success getting the numbers up that are there now. Krista will talk a little bit of that in a minute, but no room for patting ourselves on the back here. Whilst I'm very happy with Jessica's work at the UK Debt Management Office and the issuance there, it's not enough. We want a lot more. We want the UK government to hunt down more projects to include and so on. And of course, while I'm very happy with the work the IFC has been doing to grow this market, to launch two $1 billion benchmark bonds in 2013 that really kickstarted this corporate market growingly, as Barrett knows only too well, it's not enough, because the challenge, the amount of capital we need to see flowing is so massive, so huge. Well, because we'll hear more about what Barrett's doing in a minute. And then, of course, we need Iberdrola to be much bigger, much more successful on its renewable energy directives. And of course, that means more than 18 billion, but more like 36 billion of capital raising required, or more and more and more to get there. So I just want you to leave this idea. It's fantastic, but it's the next chapter that now counts. Krista, we there yet?
Okay, so let's try this again. See if this works. Are you still seeing the same?
Yes,
same
it's
slides?
good. No,
this is better.
Just click the full screen in your way, Krista, please.
Okay, and can you still see the next slide coming up, or just
keep going? It's too late now. We'll have to live with it.
Fair enough. We are going to have to bear with it. So thanks everybody for your patience. So let's get going. This report covers, it's the 11th in the series of global sustainable debt state of the market reports that we've published, and it covers the sort of quintet of what we're terming GSS plus debt in this market. We're incorporating green, social and sustainability use of proceeds bonds, transition use of proceeds bonds, which are the smaller share of this market, as well as the newer entrant of sustainability linked bonds. And the headline figure to take away from this report is that we have surpassed the 1 trillion mark of this GSS debt volume in 2021, and the cumulative total at the end of last year landed at 2.8 trillion. We have since crossed 3 trillion. So now that we're discussing this market in the context of trillions of dollars, finally, it is beginning to show some signs of mainstreaming, which we'll come to in a moment. In terms of the number of deals that we capture across these 5 key themes, and in individual securities terms, we have more than 16,000, close to 17,000 actually at the end of last year, GSS plus securities, split, obviously still very much skewed towards the green theme, which accounts for just under half of the total, but with sort of reasonably steady growth over the years, especially in the sustainability, and now a watershed moment for social bonds as a response to the pandemic in 2020, and clearly from triumph to triumph in 2021, in large parts thanks to the EU SURE program. And if we look at the actual split of the issuance in the year of 2021 in terms of monthly volumes, we can see that September was the record-breaking month. It was actually the highest individual month volume in the history of the GSS Plus market segment. And overall, all of the months at the end of each quarter seemed to go from relative strength to strength again. We only saw a reasonably sort of sharp dip at the end of the year, where obviously there was a new variant of the COVID-19 pandemic, the virus itself, the Omicron variant, which put the market sort of on its toes a little bit to see how severe this new variant would end up being. And now this year looks very different, and we'll get to the implications of some of those issues in just a moment. So again, the thematic split, I just want to draw your attention to the fact that we did see overall about 50% growth across all of these themes, but there was a significant number of or sort of volume growth in the sustainability theme, which experienced an annual year-on-year growth of 184%. But the real star of 2021, if we can say that, and of course there's caveats to this, were the sustainability or performance-linked instruments, which grew by tenfold compared to the previous year. We've also seen a welcome diversification in the social theme, in social bonds, which now hosts a much broader range of issuers and project categories than it did before. And for more details and the top issuers and lots more statistics on these market segments, feel free to dig into the report. And if you have any questions about the data, please let us know. One important theme that we always try to highlight in CBI's communications and a lot of our publications is the sovereign GSS bond club, as we fondly call it, meaning sovereign issuance in these thematic formats and different labels. This theme also saw more than doubling in 2021, and we saw a large number of debut issuers, and I'm really pleased to have one of them on the panel today. Obviously, the UK Green Gilt was the largest debut across these themes in 2021. We've also started to see, as you can tell, but especially in the sustainability theme, a lot of emerging market sovereigns come to this market, and we really think that this is a key driver, both as a demonstration issuance in lesser developed markets, and then the developed side, we are hoping that others will follow the lead of, for example, Germany and the UK in really trying to make their green bonds or green gilts benchmarks for this market. One other theme that you'll have definitely heard of if you've tuned into any of our previous communications or read through some of the other publications are taxonomies and the importance of definitions. We really believe that taxonomies and credible green definitions and disclosure in line with these are the backbone of, or is the backbone of these thematic markets, which is why we've included a dedicated spotlight section on global green taxonomies in this paper. We've highlighted the main most developed taxonomies in terms of their practical application, which are obviously the EU taxonomy as well as the China Green Bond Project Catalog, and now the later development of the so-called common ground taxonomy, which draws a comparison between the two to try and help investors make sense of how to be aligned with both. Interestingly enough, given recent developments, Russia also has a taxonomy in place, which notably excludes fossil gas, which I'm sure Sean will remark on momentarily. The UK is developing one, and we've also got a number of other taxonomy processes underway across the world. Well, the elephant in the room, low carbon energy transition, it is indeed obviously the most urgent one. We've also included a fairly lengthy and sort of meaty spotlight section on this particular topic. I'm not going to go through each of the individual points because most of the people in the audience will know this, but I just want to draw your attention to the fact that there are indeed these standards and taxonomies in place, and low carbon energy is already the most financed use of proceeds category across the GSS Plus markets. We also are developing additional criteria as Climate Bonds Initiative in collaboration with technical and industry experts to address the harder bits, because it's not just electrification. We need low carbon power and heat for industrial applications as well, and many other things to flow from this. So we are in the process of developing criteria for hydrogen, for example, and there are a number of other industrial sectors that are in public consultation at the moment, found on the CBI website. We'd also want to draw your attention to the fact that we need additional policies to support energy efficiency, which, if you've ever come across any green bond documentation, is a very, very common category of financing in this market as well. And finally, the 5 so-called driving themes that we see for this year and beyond. We've talked about the GSS Bond Club, GSS Plus Bond Club, which is actually now the plus has been added in 2022 with the global first sovereign sustainability linked bond from Chile. This is going to continue to be absolutely crucial in terms of leveraging what is the largest part of the debt capital markets. The most bond volume in the vanilla side of the market is still very much in the govies, the sovereign bonds, and we need to see them put their weight behind the climate transition as quickly as possible. And related to that, governments obviously have multiple levers through which they can help advance the building of adaptive capacity and resilience to the myriad impacts of climate change, which the panel will surely touch on in just a moment. And finally, in addition to taxonomies and low carbon energy, I want to also highlight the necessity of transition. And in this context, in this paper, what we mean is drawing the line from individual securities and their sort of frameworks and disclosure to the issuers of said securities. One way of doing this is through the sustainability linked theme, but also we would like to see much more by way of robustness in those actual net zero transition strategies, whether they come from corporates or countries or anywhere in between. And if you'd like to access all of the findings, you can find them on our website. The link is just there. And I believe my colleagues have posted the link to the paper also in the chat. There are also lots and lots of other publications on the same page, and we'd love to hear any feedback that you might have. And I thank you for your time and listening to this short presentation. over to you, Sean.
Thank you, Krista. Thank you so much. And lovely report cover, I like to think. I want to just at this point say thank you to the sponsors of this report, to the Luxembourg Green Exchange, to JP Morgan, to the Green Bond Technical Assistance Program of the IFC, which is done in coordination with 3 European countries. Bear might want to give in some more detail later. We couldn't have done this without their support, their resourcing for this program. So thank you. I'd like to go to our panel now. First, I'd like to start with Jessica, because, you know, the UK government was the big splash last year in the autumn of issuance. And not only a big splash in terms of issuance, but a big splash in terms of market response, which was crazy. Jessica, tell us the story.
Thank you very much indeed, Sean, for that. And also thank you to Krista for the presentation as well. It's a real pleasure to be here and to have the opportunity to talk to your audience today about the story behind what happened last year. And indeed, a number of you on the panel were intimately familiar with the process which we went through. The launch of the UK's green financing programme, it was a huge milestone for us at the UK Debt Management Office, also for our colleagues at Her Majesty's Treasury. We are an executive agency of Her Majesty's Treasury, responsible for debt issuance and cash management and so on. But I would say it was also a milestone for the ESG market more broadly. Obviously, before the government took a decision to issue, we'd been closely monitoring developments in the ESG market for many years, and we'd engaged with market stakeholders over a sustained period. And from the wider government perspective, the inception of the Green Financing Programme was part of the UK's efforts to mainstream green financial products, to attract dedicated funding for the net zero target and also other environmental objectives, to finance sustainable projects, to deploy much needed infrastructure, and also to create green jobs across the country. And the programme clearly supports the UK's ambitious environmental and climate goals as they were outlined in the government's net zero strategy published last October. And one key point to highlight is that it was important for us from the start to ensure that the UK's sovereign green bonds, or green gilts as we term them, that they raise financing for green projects in a smooth and cost-effective a way as possible, and also, importantly, in a way which is fully in line with the government's debt management objective, and that is to minimise cost over the long term, subject to risk. So in order to achieve this, we considered the Green Gilt programme holistically in the context of our overall financing programme, and in particular, with a focus on integrating green gilt issuance with our overall gilt programme. I think it's hard to overestimate the amount of preparatory work which was needed, as well as the depth of market engagement which was involved in this programme launch. Engagement which is actually relatively unusual for the DMO in its standard gilt issuance process. We had 2 global investor calls, one in July following the publication of the framework, more of an investor education exercise, one in September. We had more than 2 weeks of investor education over the summer, and then a more classic marketing roadshow ahead of the first issue in September. And this was to ensure that we communicated the key aspects of the framework underpinning the Green Gilt to as wide a universe of investors as possible, not only in the UK, but also internationally. And I think this engagement was genuinely welcomed by the investor community, and it formed part of a process which involved this really thorough preparation, not only in terms of our own work at the DMO, of course, to ensure that all our systems, our processes and so on were ready for launch, but also in terms of preparing all the background and documentation for the transaction. The framework document, of course, which is critical. And in the UK's case, importantly, this covered the whole green financing programme, including the retail green savings bonds, which were issued through our sister institution, National Savings and Investments, allowing households the opportunity to participate in the UK government's green agenda. This was a first for the market. And this framework was developed in accordance with the Green Bond Principles published by the ICMA, the 2021 version, also mapped to the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals referenced by Sean earlier. And complementing this, we had a second party opinion provided by VE, an affiliate of Moody's. Also, again, another innovation, we had a pre-issuance impact assessment provided by the Carbon Trust. And this assessment, assessed the proposed green financing activities and the metrics by which to measure the impacts of these, that they were consistent with the government's climate targets and overall environmental policies. So this suite of key documents, they're publicly available on the DMO's website. They allowed this very meaningful engagement. And there were an enormous number of people involved in this program, without which it could not have happened. Particularly, of course, colleagues in the Treasury and across government, but also the structuring advisors. One of them is on this panel this afternoon. The second party opinion provider, the pre-issuance impact assessor. Also, we had legal advisors, needless to say. We had stakeholder discussion fora. Again, CBI is a member of that. The book runners, of course, the list goes on. And there was a very robust governance process around that. And as to the issuance itself, which is covered, by the way, in the report, which has just been presented here, we launched our inaugural Green Gilt on the 21st of September 21. This was the inception of the program. It was a 12-year issue, a 2033 final maturity. And as Sean highlighted, it broke a number of records. It was a real landmark. The inaugural issue totaled £10 billion in size. It was the largest green sovereign bond to have been launched at that time. It also attracted the largest ever order book for a sovereign green bond. And I think that showed very visibly the enthusiasm of sterling bond market participants for green assets. We saw very broad, very diverse, and extremely high quality investor support for the transaction. And third, we also saw the largest number of different investors ever participating in a syndicated gilt offering for the UK, including some investors who were purchasing gilts for the very first time. Now, I could go on if I have time, Sean, just to describe why we selected the 12-year maturity, for example. Maybe I could spend.
Why did you? I've always wondered that.
Yes, a lot of people have asked that question. So we followed exactly the same process for our green gilts as we do for our standard gilts. This was important to enshrine the green financing program in the government's overall program. So in the case of this particular gilt, the first one, we took soundings from market participants through our regular consultation meetings, which we hold on a quarterly basis, both with our primary dealers or gilt-edged market makers, GEMs as we term them, and also with investors. And they concluded that a maturity of around 10 years was the natural place to begin building out a yield curve. It's the most liquid maturity point. And in the gilt market, we typically launch bonds slightly longer than their true benchmark maturity so that they have time to build up before they actually reach the benchmark point. And there was also a natural gap in the gilt yield curve where a new current coupon bond was needed. We also felt that this maturity would attract investors globally, many of whom have investment mandates out to around the 10-year point. And this was also the process that we followed with the second green gilt offering, which we launched in October. This was a $6 billion 32-year gilt maturing in 2053. And this makes it the longest maturity sovereign green bond in the world. We opted for this again, following the same process. It's a very important maturity point for our core UK-based, what we call liability-driven investors. These are typically pension funds and insurance companies who form such an important part of the gilt investor base. And they typically seek long-dated assets to hedge their long-dated liabilities. So the 30-year point tends to be the most liquid in this sector. And as the Chancellor announced as long ago as November 2020, the UK is looking to build a green yield curve over time. So we were keen to ensure that there are more similarities than differences between the UK's Green Gilt programme and our standard gilt programme. It was important for maturity selection. It was also important in terms of the fact that they are included in the same relevant bond indices, that they are eligible for repo transactions, that they carry the same characteristics as standard gilts in order to ensure that they will have the same liquidity characteristics over time. There are obviously some key differences in terms of reporting, in terms of the use of proceeds structure, and so on. I would also flag another important innovation which we brought to the programme and to the overall sovereign green bond space, which was the inclusion of biodiversity in terms of the categories which were eligible. So in keeping with recognised standards, the government is going to report on the allocation of proceeds to specific green expenditures, also on the environmental impacts, and also, again, another innovation to report on the social co-benefits of these expenditures. So I will pause and leave it there. There's more that I could say, but I'm conscious of the time and other panelists as well. Thank you, Sean.
Thanks, Jessica. It's a big story. There's a lot going on there. And of course, one of the key features of the last couple of years, the last few years, has been the growth of the sovereign market, kicked off initially by Poland, the first issuer of all places, and then France soon afterwards. And now we have a whole lot, particularly in Europe, where we have not only Germany, France, Netherlands, Spain, Italy, etc., and a few other countries, Denmark being the most recent newcomer to the market, but also the European Commission that's now done a very substantial green program of sovereign level AAA issuance here. Of course, this market was kick-started by development banks. In 2008, we saw the European Investment Bank issue a climate awareness bond, and then not long after, the World Bank issued a green bond, and not long after that, the IFC, the private sector sister of the World Bank, into this market. Berit, you've been involved in this for a long time. We've been talking about this for years now. Can you tell us a little bit of that story, and especially how you see this story unfolding in emerging markets, where some 70% of all the capex to address climate change is going to be expended in the next 30 years?
Thank you, Sean. You're really going back to history now. Yes, IFC issued its first green bond in 2010, and shortly after did 2 benchmark bonds in the same year, 2013. And the rest is history, so to say. But as you raised an important point here, it was the MDBs that kind of opened this market and gave it the liquidity and the credibility. And that's actually the same thing I see sovereigns are doing these days, because you see emerging market opening up with sustainable finance action plans, and often it's underpinned by a sovereign themed bond, being it green or being it social. Part of the work that IFC do, and I actually work across a number of action areas, is I'm working from green all the way to transition finance, and I'm working both on the supply side, working with IFC Treasury when we issue a green bond, but also with the investment team when IFC invests in any of these themes bonds. And then, of course, the market capacity building, which is working with potential issuers in emerging market on how to issue a sustainable finance instrument. It's delivering executed training for emerging market financial institutions that are kind of feeding into the funds that IFC also have invested in, like the EGO and the VIGIO, that I'm, developing the demand for emerging market theme instruments. And it's advising the emerging market regulatory authorities on how do they establish this sustainable framework and how do they get started. And then not to forget, it's also as a member of the Green and Social Principles Executive Committee.
Berit, one of the programs that I found most interesting for the IFC in terms of going forward is the 30-30 program, which is the commitment to work with
financial
IFC.
institutions.
Exactly.
Yes.
Just tell us about that.
Yeah. So the 30-by-30 is working with financial institutions in emerging markets, helping them to green their portfolio, to build the whole infrastructure and the plumbing that enables them to eventually issue a green bond. It's also helping them to start thinking about climate risk management, because that's part of it, that you manage your risk on your book. And this is complemented with the Green Bond Technical Assistance Program, delivering the training to these potential issuers on how do you actually issue. The 30-by-30 is the goal of it, reducing emissions by 30% by 2030. So that's the name of it. And that's what is developing the whole sustainable finance market in these emerging markets.
Which is a very important development. Of course, the other big development that's going to happen in the coming year in emerging markets is around resilience and SDGs and social. You're across all of these let's call it flavors of gelato here at the moment. What's the chatter you see? What's the nature of engagement support around that whole resilience, SDG, social discussion in emerging markets?
I think there are a lot of interesting aspects to it. I mean, we have already touched upon the sovereign and the sovereign's role, and we have seen emerging market sovereigns move from the green to the social to now also doing the sustainability link, which is their way of underpinning the regulatory changes in the market. It's also their way of funding the commitments of the Glasgow Climate Pact. We also see an uptake in the emerging markets on the sustainability linked. And I want to mention transition in this context because the sustainability linked instrument tend to be used as the first step on transition, because I think a number of issuers hesitate getting into transition because of the criteria that you need to have a pathway all the way to net zero no later than 2050, meeting the goals of the Paris Agreement. And for industries and for countries as in emerging markets as well, they just don't know how to get there. So instead of committing to something that they don't know, committing to a pathway that they don't know, the technology may not even be there, then they start with a sustainability linked instruments saying, okay, I am starting my journey here, moving in this direction.
For those of you who might be interested, the Green Bond Technical Assistance Program of the IFC is worth a look at if you're an emerging market. You can find details on the IFC website. We'll see if we can post a link in the chat in a couple of minutes just to draw attention to that. I want to shift to Paul, if I may. Paul, hey, you're one of the world's leading green bond bankers and ESG bond bankers, I should say. Your remit is much larger. You're working all over the place. We've had a quiet first quarter. Should people panic? Should people worry? That's the first question. And the second question is, in the light of your answer to that, what's going to happen in the next 12 months? What are the growth sectors? What are you hearing from clients?
Sure. First of all, thanks for the invitation. It's nice to see you again. So quiet first quarter. This is a long-term game we're engaged here in. So, the issues that we're trying to address, they're going to play out over many decades. So whatever the market is doing right now doesn't really matter. The bond market rises and falls depending on, amongst other things, central bank policy. We're going to see, quantitative tightening, things like that. And clearly the ESG bond market floats on top of the bond market more generally. So obviously, there's an interconnectivity there. So, I'm personally not worried. And the reason I'm not worried is, I think the issues that we're trying to address, are not really going in the right direction yet. We are only starting addressing some of these challenges. So, if I felt the problems were being solved, I would be a bit worried that the downturn reflected, a feeling that the market had resolved some of these challenges around, for example, low carbon electricity generation, things like that. I mean, most of the ESG metrics are going in the wrong direction. So there's a huge amount more work to do. And, we and I personally believe that the bond market will be used as a tool, and bonds will be used as instruments in the toolbox, to help corporates engage investors in support of the evolution of those business models, the development of new technologies, the greening of the economy generally, development of a low carbon energy system, all of these things. Bonds will remain a very useful, perhaps one of the most useful tools in the toolbox. So that's not going to change. And whilst we might have some rises and falls based on what's generally happening in the bond markets, I don't think we're going to stop using bonds as a tool to address these things. And, we'll probably be talking about something completely different, this time next year. So I don't see this sort of short-term dip as anything other than a function of what's happening with, central bank policy more generally. And, that's sort of feeding through into what we're seeing in the ESG labeled debt markets. In terms of, I think your second point was what can we expect ahead? For me, it's going to be to an extent more the same. I think in developed markets, we're going to see a maturing, a sort of a steady state, and most issuers will be looking to, I guess you could say, keep their propositions refreshed. We spend a lot of time working with issuers in developed markets, investment grade, et cetera, who are well down the track, and they just need ideas on how to keep their proposition refreshed in the market, how to keep it differentiated. I think the big story is going to be emerging markets. I think there's a clear opportunity there to secure the support of the debt investor and the fixed income community in, helping those economies, develop along a clean pathway. There's a great opportunity to skip over, in fact, a lot of the technologies that are causing a problem right now. In the same way, we saw a lot of emerging market economies skip over fixed line telecoms infrastructure, for example, and go straight to wireless. I think there's an analogous situation potentially where we could skip over a lot of the fossil fuel based energy infrastructure and skip straight to renewables. So I think, as the underlying technologies mature, I think debt investors are going to be more comfortable investing in infrastructure projects in these emerging markets. As the technology improves, the credit profile improves, you can crowd in more investors, and I think we'll see a sort of a virtuous circle developing there. So for me, going forward, EM is going to be a big part of the story.
And of course, one of the things we're beginning to see is G7 countries become much more proactive in terms of supporting green developments in emerging markets. And I note particularly the joint announcement at COP by European, US, and I think the UK as well, around South Africa and supporting the South African transition framework going forward. Of course, you've got yet to see what that deal actually looks like, but I know there are conversations in multiple markets around that, which is another way to end up getting green bond issuance out of South Africa, because they will be tapping public markets for some of that capital with some credit support by rich countries. Of course, this collaboration between Europe, US, the UK, and a couple of other G7 countries is a feature of the newish US administration. Things have changed in the last couple of years. We've got one just slightly left field question for Jessica. Given that, is there any chance, do you think, that the US will do a green T-bill at some point? You don't need to answer, Jessica, but I'm going to put it to you. It came up on the side. Of course, the US government has said nothing about it, and we don't expect them to say anything about it before releasing it. But what's your hunch? Is this going to become an impossible pressure for them?
I thank you very much. I mean, it's obviously a good question. It would be, it would. Given the market depth of the US Treasury market, that would be a significant development. But I obviously have no insight into what our US Treasury colleagues might do, and it would be absolutely wrong for me to make any speculation as to that. I think what is encouraging is what a number of different countries have done in this space. Including just recently, obviously, we saw Canada entering the market for the first time, which was a very interesting development. I thought one additional point, which I didn't make in my opening remarks, but you might be interested in, is what our plans are for this year in terms of green gilt issuance. So the DMO's remit was announced, our overall financing remit was announced on the 23rd of March, alongside the UK Chancellor of the Exchequer's spring statement. And this is something that happens every year, where we announce our overall financing plans for the coming year. So we set that out to give the market some visibility and transparency on what our plans might be. And as part of that, we were particularly pleased to be able to announce our plans for green gilt issuance. We announced that we're going to be issuing £10 billion of green gilts in this fiscal year. So that's the fiscal year which just started for the UK at the beginning of April and continues to the end of March 2023. It's currently anticipated that new green gilt transactions will be scheduled each quarter, so that one will be scheduled each quarter, and our sales will be focused on reopening the existing lines that we issued last year. That is the 2033 and 2053 bonds, with a view to building up the liquidity in those bonds over time. As I highlighted, that was a very important consideration for us in the program. And indeed, we have, because we've published our calendar for this coming quarter, we just did that at the end of March, and we've announced that we are going to be reopening the 2033 green gilt via auction on the 10th of May. So I thought I would let you know that. Thank you.
Fantastic. That's great. And it's very interesting you've taken the approach to reopen the bond rather than create a new bond. It's I guess for all sovereign issuers, the question about the role of the bond in the market, not to how to make it easier, is a factor. You certainly talked about the demonstration role of the UK gilt in terms of getting a larger market going in the broader market, providing liquidity, providing benchmark pricing, and so on. Do you see that beginning to do? Are you getting a lot of inquiries from commercial actors about potential issuance? Is the DMO having to take on a technical assistance role effectively?
I think what was important was that there was a sovereign curve in the green market. And I'd be interested in colleagues' views on the panel here about this. But I think having a sovereign pricing reference is very useful for those corporates or financial institutions, particularly obviously in the sterling market, who might be planning their own issues. And that was definitely a factor to be considered when we approached the green financing program.
Paul, one for you to pick up.
Yeah, no, I mean, absolutely. It's a key step in getting the market going, and people really value that reference point. And a lot of things are based off these curves and how investors think about what they're prepared to pay up for security. So having this reference point is super important in getting the market going. So absolutely, having the sovereign go, establish that curve, and then allowing other issuers to follow in behind. I think that's just a way to get the market going in the quickest way possible. So absolutely. Makes total sense.
Berit, emerging markets again, and I want to keep going back to it because 70% of all capex to address climate change is going to be in emerging markets the next 30 years. We need to understand that. Can you tell us what you see as the biggest likely directions in terms of opportunities going forward in the coming year, based on what we've now seen happen last year?
I see blue as one of the colors coming up.
Nice.
You may have noticed that IFC issued the blue finance taxonomy earlier this year, and we experienced a lot of interest on blue, and that automatically leads to biodiversity as one of the other themes coming up. And that both of them ties into the adaptation, which I think you briefly touched upon. Adaptation finance is way behind what it needed to be, and we all know that adaptation finance is will be in particular in need in the emerging markets, because they are those that are most hit by the physical climate risk. So I think the increased focus on adaptation that we will see this year, given that it's one of the key topics of COP27 in Egypt later, this year will give it a new focus. Another thing that will eventually come up is just transition, because as we get into deep decarbonization, this is a matter that will become more and more important. And I think you already saw that topic come up in the agreement that was made with South Africa and their transition out of coal. While I have the floor, let me just then add
Please.
to the question about should we be worried about the slow start this year? I wouldn't worry so much about it, because it's not the first time we have seen the market be slow and then it catches up in the last month of the year. So we still have a few months to go.
Such an optimist. We've unfortunately lost Jesus Martinez from Iberdrola in Madrid. Haven't been able to re-establish connection. So, c'est la vie. Worth noting, everyone, Iberdrola has been a large corporate issuer in the market, and a big chunk of this market are corporates going forward. Krista, perhaps you could just comment on the share of the market that's corporate and the growth rates. Is it growth rate, or is it leveling off and sovereigns, Jessica Pilley's work, is taking off? What's actually happening here?
Sure. Yes, it depends on obviously which theme and which segment of the market you look at sort of geographically, but if we just keep it simple, and again, I'd obviously encourage everybody to dig into the report, because all of this is very much sliced and diced in the data, and we'll be publishing a Q1 review next week as well, so you can kind of see how it's starting to shift. It's about half corporates globally, so we're splitting between financial and non-financial, and that share has been relatively consistent over time. Sovereigns are picking up, and we've heard from obviously first-hand accounts, but also I'd like to highlight the fact that we've already seen a number of new entrants on the green side in the first couple of months of 2022. Importantly, Canada, first North American sovereign green bond, Denmark, which was a long time in the making for those of you who've been following the debate on the structural issues on the Danish green bond, and a really, really landmark announcement. This is to one of the questions in the Q&A from India. The question was, who do we think will catalyze the market the most on the emerging market sides? Obviously India, and would like to see some similar activity from China, though there's other constraints around market structure there. And of course, that famous US Green Tea bill, which would probably be some kind of opening of floodgates on that side of the world. But I'll leave it to speculation on how likely that is in this particular year. I will say though, but on the North American side, that we've seen a lot more movement than ever before in North America for all sorts of sustainable debt in 2021. And that is obviously the part of the world where the issuance is mostly skewed, or the most skewed, towards large investment grade corporates across all of the different themes. So you've got really the household names that are now hopping on the bandwagon, which is great because we need this to help with liquidity and really mainstreaming, be able to grow these mandates from all sorts of different investors and create benchmarks. That's the only way to sort of get the big bucks moving, as it were.
We're in the last few minutes of our webinar today, folks. We're attempting to answer live typing a few responses to questions in the Q&A, and I've tried to weave some into the conversation. But I want to finish up on hopes and expectations for the future. And Paul, you're an EMEA banker, and you're particularly focused on the European market, which is half global GSS issuance. So it's is where the center has become, if you like. It didn't start out this way. The market was dominated by US dollar issuance, by supranational issuance in particular, and we had a lot of US and Chinese, but the European market was really taken off in the last couple of years. Can you tell us a little bit about your hopes and expectations for the market going forward?
Sure. I mean, in terms of hopes, I would hope that in those industry sectors which are most critical to making this sustainable economy happen, low carbon energy, etc., that not being an issuer would be the exception, and that most of the companies who operate in those sectors, thinking oil and gas, power utilities, chemicals, autos, et cetera, that they would all have issued some sort of ESG label bond and set out their stall and given the market the opportunity to decide whether or not to endorse their strategy. So, I think we're already, pretty close to that situation in some sectors. And I think we see a tipping point sector by sector where all the constituents in a particular industry sector feel, well, most of our peers have done this and the spotlight is sort of gradually moving on to us. And the question is coming from investors, why haven't you guys done it? Is there some reason why, your situation is different to that of your peers? So as each industry sector sort of adds ESG labels or greens its bond offerings, it incrementally increases the pressure on the rest of the sector. And I would hope that we would see more of those tipping points come through. And for those key industry sectors, I'd like to see a situation in Europe where, not having any ESG labeled bond outstanding is very much the exception. So I think that's going to be important. We're already pretty close to that sort of situation in some sectors. There's a ways to go in others. And I think we have this sort of safety in numbers type phenomenon as well, where once there's a sort of a critical mass of issuers in a particular sector, a lot of the remaining issuers derive a lot of comfort from that. And they're more incentivized to come out and be, and sort of engage with investors and bring that first, green or ESG or SLB or whatever it might be to the market. So that would be my hope, that we would see a continuation of that process. But, we are well down the track in Europe. And it's just a question of gradually raising the bar in terms of how impactful the green or social or other ESG label spend can be. And what's really helping is the technology is getting better. The technology is maturing, costs are going down. Of course, there's going to be some bumps on the road. We've seen some of that recently in the renewable energy industry, the COVID overhang, cost inflation, all these sorts of things. When I hear about that, it doesn't worry me, because for me, it's just a signal that the sector is now big enough to worry about, and it's just going through this growth phase. If we weren't hearing any of this, it would mean the sector didn't matter. So for me, things that are presented as negatives, I often find are actually in the long term positives. So that would be my hope and expectation for the future.
Fantastic.
Sean, if I could add to that. Please. So I totally agree with Paul's observations here, and I actually see it already in the market. And like we, for instance, saw Repsol, which is a brown issuer, and they had some troubles when they went to market with their green bond in 2017, where the market kind of thumped their nose at them. But they have gone to market now with a sustainable finance framework that covers everything from green to sustainability linked to climate transition. So they are all over the platter, so to say, and they have actually built a whole funding program around that. That's one thing. Another thing we see is that investors are increasingly asking to issuers overall sustainability strategy and performance, even for the user perceived products. So even if you are a green bond and you go to market with your green bond and your green asset or green activities, investors are likely to ask, so how is your overall transition strategy? What's your overall objectives on sustainability? And I think that is also helping to change the market.
Really, really good point. I know one investor in Sweden, which is the highest per capita green bond market in the world, who now tells me that when someone does a bond, if they haven't done a green or sustainable bond, they do ask, picking up Paul's point earlier, is there something we should know about you? Is there something wrong with your organization? Things have changed, haven't they, Barrett, since this got going a while ago. It is also worth noting that in November last year, 40% of all corporate bonds issued in Europe, according to Bloomberg, were ESG or related bonds, which is an extraordinary milestone, again, given how far we've come. But Jessica, you've got a fantastic program. It's cool, it's neat, it's established. You know what you're doing this year. You have every expectation further success. I mean, of course, you've got a bit of a challenge because you've got to try and get the government to give you more things you can put in the bond. We, of course, want that to be successful. Tell us a bit about your hopes and expectations more globally for the coming year. I appreciate, you're a debt manager, obviously. You can't say everything, but what can you tell us? Get us all a bit excited.
Well, thank you again, Sean, and thank you for the great discussion on this panel. I've already given a little bit of a forward look as to what the government is planning to do in terms of the green gilt issuance this year. So we've got 10 billion. We've got the first reopening happening in May, as early as May, just in a couple of weeks' time, a little bit more. But as you say, ultimately, the overall size going forward beyond this year is going to depend on the projects underlying the green gilt issuance. And that in turn is reliant on a number of different departments. And of course, we've been working very closely with departments across government. So, you know, I'm very hopeful that the issuance this year is as warmly received as the issuance that we undertook last year. I think, you know, hopefully with the 2033 auction on the 10th of May, that will set a positive trend for the next year. But it clearly has been a major focus for the UK DMO, particularly for the Treasury over the last year, and we hope to see that going forward as well. Thank you.
Krista, thank you for the report. Any last words?
Expectations for this year. I mean, I'll just reinforce what the rest of the lovely panel has said, that it's not, even though we've seen the slowdown now initially this year with, you know, the withdrawal of these emergency pandemic asset purchase programs and rates going up and everything else, this is temporary. And I'd like to see, especially sort of highly rated issuers, just keep coming to market, especially in these conditions, because we have really credible data that shows that green bonds are a great way to withstand market volatility. You can, in certain conditions, get cheaper pricing. So just do it and finance the energy transition if you can. Low carbon energy, storage, grids, the whole shebang, and we'll be in business.
Just do it, she said. Folks, you know what the challenge is. You know we've got to get capital flowing, make a challenge. This is an instrument we're talking about here, bond and so on, but it is incredibly powerful to excite people, to get investors connected with issuers, and to, of course, get governments to realise that they can finance the transition without necessarily increasing taxes. There is actually a useful reallocation of debt streams that can be used here, as we're seeing in terms of the excitement of governments doing something about this. But this is well and truly established as a theme. It's a proof of concept, but it's not enough. It's not enough. We need to be seeing $5 trillion a year flowing into green debt capital markets going forward, let alone the social and resilience aspects that have got to be added onto that. We need to get moving. We've got a lot to do to get emissions down 50% by 2030 globally, and to address the resilience challenges to make sure our societies don't fall over every time they get hit by a catastrophe, a climate catastrophe, a pandemic, or a war, which is going to be a feature of this century. We need a lot of bankers, we need a lot of investors, we need a lot of development banks, we need a lot of issuers. So folks, get to work. Just remember, don't walk, run. Good luck. Thank you for being part of this extraordinary movement.
Thank you, Sean.
Thank you. Thank you, Paul. Thank you, Jessica. Thank you, Barrett, for joining us today.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank
you.
you very much.